The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword is probably the most controversial game in the series. In this video I want to talk about the recent HD remake, the problems addressed by that remake, the ways in which Skyward Sword still sucks and will always suck, and why despite its many, many flaws, it is still a Zelda game. Maybe even a very good one. To start, I want to talk about the biggest problem Skyward Sword has. And no, I am not talking about Fi, or the hand-holding, or the motion controls. The HD version has addressed all those fairly well. The cutscenes are now skippable, Fi doesn't interrupt the flow of the game as much, and the motion controls are now optional. Now all of these are great improvements, but they've made it more obvious that they were never the game's real problem. In my opinion, the real problem with Skyward Sword is the overworld, or rather the lack of an overworld. The three provinces in the game cannot rightfully be called an overworld. They're more like extensions of the dungeon. They're an endless series of traversal puzzles that you engage with over and over and over until you get to the actual dungeon. They are easily the worst part of the game, and they're also what most of the game consists of. The problem with these areas is that they're mentally exhausting, not because the puzzles are hard, but because there's no location in any map where you can just be. Let's compare this to how other, better Zelda games handled the overworld and the pre-dungeon experience. Ocarina of Time. What happens before you enter dungeons? Well, let's look at dungeon number 2, Dodongo's Cavern. You go through the overworld, you go into a town near the dungeon, you immerse yourself in the town's atmosphere, and then you go into the dungeon. If there's any traversal puzzles at all, they are short and unintrusive. Same with dungeon 3. Overworld, immersive town relating to the dungeon, and finally the dungeon. Wind Waker, Dragon Roost Isle, Overworld, Town, short traversal puzzle, Dungeon. Same with the Forest Haven, Overworld, Town, short traversal puzzle, Dungeon. Now I'm not saying that every pre-dungeon experience is like this, or that following this formula will lead to success. My point is that the Overworld and the Town sections in Zelda games are important, because they give the player ample time to mentally prepare for the actual dungeons. There are clear borders between what is and isn't a dungeon. But in Skyward Sword, dungeons are just more of what I've been doing already. They lose some of their impact because you've been doing puzzles every step of the way. There's no section that acts like a natural rest period. In the second area of Skyward Sword, after having made it to the door that leads into the area dungeon, you're informed that you need to gather 5 pieces of a key to enter. They are located across the province and you can now douse for their location. I almost quit playing when they told me I have to wander around this area more and dig for these keys. None of these puzzles are hard, they're just time-consuming and needless. Worst of all, they lessen my enjoyment of the actual dungeons, which sucks because a lot of those dungeons are very cool. Was it really important that I go through the Skyview Temple again to get sacred water before I could go to the next dungeon? At this point, the game already made me do a Silent Realm challenge, climb the giant tree to find a Kikwi, and go through a water area to talk to the water dragon. Was it really necessary that after all that, you make me go through a dungeon I've already cleared before you let me into the next? In other Zelda games, the overworld and the towns help with the pacing, but in Skyward Sword the closest thing to an overworld is the sky, and there's nothing to do there. There's only one town, and it's unrelated to any of the other regions. The quests in the town itself are short and uninteresting fetch quests, and you can't even do most of them until you progress in the game. Skyloft is in a separate map area. It has nothing to do with the province you're currently tackling. So if I want to relax and get out of the puzzle-solving headspace before going into the dungeon, I have to leave the area entirely. What's weird about me criticizing this aspect of Skyward Sword is that I actually really like puzzles. In fact, my only complaint about Breath of the Wild is how that game handled puzzles. If Skyward Sword is a game with no overworld, then Breath of the Wild is a game with no dungeons. So with the last Zelda game leaving me starved for puzzles, I thought I'd look at Skyward Sword more favorably. But even after 10 years, it's just too much. When people complain about the game's linearity, I think what they're really talking about is this: the incessant, mentally draining, never-ending stream of traversal puzzles that make up the majority of the game. What's so galling about it is that it negatively impacts the parts of the game that are actually good. The proper dungeon areas and the story are some of the best in the series. But those dungeons are marred by having to tackle them after a draining overworld, and the story is hurt by the excuses the game comes up with to keep me running from place to place. I wouldn't have minded the backtracking so much if the game didn't present me with so many stupid justifications. There comes a point in the game where you have to power up your sword. Okay, fine. But the goddess is the one that built all this stuff. Why did she need me to turn these windmills to open the path to the Thunderhead? Why do I have to go into the Thunderhead in the first place? All I do there is learn one song at a time and then immediately leave. There's no reason why these songs couldn't have just been learned in the goddess statue, or why Fi couldn't have just been programmed with all of them. The game is full of this immersion-breaking bullshit that makes it clear that the goddess is just interested in extending the game time. I can forgive the normal backtracking, some of it is actually pretty cool. Going back to Lanayru and exploring the Sand Sea is fantastic. And I'll even defend the stealth section and the Tad tones, because at least that was new. But there was no excuse for making me go back through Skyview Temple to get Sacred Water, or making me traverse the entire Elden region again with the robot. It could have just let me straight into the next dungeon, but instead the game chose to waste my time with more obstacles. There's something psychologically damaging about being told that the goal is right in front of you, and then having to go do a bunch of other superfluous garbage before you can engage with it. These never-ending excuses to send you somewhere else to do more pre-dungeon traversal puzzles are exhausting, and they make the backtracking so much worse than it needed to be. And that's a shame, because anybody that defends Skyward Sword will tell you how good some of those dungeons and bosses are. Even very negative reviews for the original admitted that the Ancient Cistern and Coloctos were awesome. The HD version of Skyward Sword is the best version of the game. It's better than anything you can emulate, and its improvements are substantial. But if you hated Skyward Sword's core experience, there isn't anything about the higher resolution or the 60 frames per second that's going to change your mind. However, despite the incredible frustration I feel towards the game at times, there are aspects to it that it does amazingly. And if you can get past its many problems, you're in for an experience that, in my opinion, pretty much redeems the whole game. I want to start my defense of Skyward Sword on a controversial point. I think the motion controls are awesome. Skyward Sword is one of the few games that ever did them well. I realize that a lot of people had trouble getting them to work right, but when it did work, the experience was splendid. The appeal of one-to-one sword control for combat is obvious. Swinging your Wiimote to swing the sword is as immersive as a gameplay experience is going to get. Motion controls in general were probably never going to go anywhere commercially, but at least for Skyward Sword, I thought they were fantastic. If you learn to enjoy the motion controls, the game becomes way better. I think it's no exaggeration to say that it's maybe twice as good. There are no hard Zelda games, but if there was one, it would be Skyward Sword. It's one of the only 3D games in the series where the combat has anything to do with skill, or timing, or precise decision-making. It's one of the only ones where combat requires anything from you as a player, and where it's something that you can get better at over time. When you like the combat, the problems with the overworld become downright tolerable, and the dungeons, which are already great, get to culminate on a high note, with some of the best bosses the series has ever had. For me, Skyward Sword redefined what it means to have a good boss battle in a Zelda game. In previous 3D Zelda games, what made a good boss was its presentation, or its design, or the build-up, or the use of spectacle. But it was never the actual combat or the boss mechanics. And then in Skyward Sword, we get Girahim as the first boss. Girahim is a sterling example of what a boss should be. Everything about him is done masterfully. His design, his presentation, his battle theme, the way his character's personality shines out in the combat. Girahim has got it all, and he knows it. If you slash at his hand, he'll catch your sword between his fingers, and if you don't yank it out, he'll steal it and use it before finally throwing it at you. At this point in the game, you're likely to have 6 hearts, and you won't be very experienced with the combat, and at most you'll have 2 bottles that may or may not have healing items. All of these factors contribute to Girahim being one of the hardest 3D Zelda bosses up until that point. He's such a great boss because he serves as both a tutorial that makes it clear what the sword combat is going to be like, and a wall that makes sure you learn before you progress. To this day, he's the only boss in the series I've died to, and he got me twice. Now admittedly, not every boss in the game measures up to this level of quality, but the ones that do it well. The motion controls make a lot of these things better, but only if you found them immersive and enjoyable. If you didn't, then a lot of what I said won't make much sense. The HD version allows you to use button-only controls, and if you don't like the motion controls, you should. They work fine, but I'm not exaggerating on how distasteful I find the linear open-world progression. It's an absolutely miserable experience, and without the engaging motion-controlled combat to distract me, I seriously doubt I'd have been able to finish the game. I would highly recommend giving motion controls a try. The second thing Skyward Sword does well is its story, but not necessarily its plot, because the actual sequence of events is often terrible, mainly because of the poor story justifications for all the backtracking I've already mentioned, but it also suffers from an interesting problem. The game is too self-aware. All Zelda games are perfect hero's journeys. They all have Link start in the ordinary world. He experiences the call to adventure. He receives supernatural aid from magical helpers. He crosses the first threshold, leaving his home, and undergoes a series of trials that will eventually transform him into a hero. The hero's journey is great. It's one of the reasons Zelda games will never get old. Humans have never gotten tired of hearing variations to this theme. The problem is that Skyward Sword knows that. The whole plot of the game is that Hylia built all these temples, all these structures, as well as the sacred flames and the Song of the Heroes, as a means to turn Link into a badass. I'm not kidding, that's the plot. The puzzles, the silent realms, the going from place to place, all of it was done to cultivate Link's spiritual growth and make him worthy of using the Triforce. She's metagaming the hero's journey. And because Skyward Sword is the first game in the timeline, its hyper-awareness manifests in very unfortunate ways. As the first, it has to justify the other game's themes and motifs. For example, the establishment of the cycle. Demise is introduced as the primordial villain for all of the games. An incarnation of him is born in every age. But that's not much different than what we had before. It doesn't explain why he reincarnates other than he's literally too angry to die. It doesn't show why he hates the gods or why he can't be killed. How is that any different from the story we had with Ganon? I just don't see the point, especially as we are unlikely to see Demise again in future titles. Same thing with the Master Sword. The game sets out to show its origin, but its origin is just, oh yeah, it was made by the goddess and you power it up. Is that any more meaningful than what we had before? I'm not sure it is. And then there's the justification for Link's green tunic. Apparently the origin of Link's iconic attire is that knights just have it as their uniform, and green just happens to be the color this year. Except that we already had a good origin story for Link's clothing, especially the hat. In the Minish Cap, there was this whole emotional scene at the end where Eslo gives Link his first hat. But no, let's just throw all that out there because we forgot about it and we have to shoehorn connections in with the rest of the games. Now that said, I do still think Skyward Sword tells a good story, just not through the plot. The story in this game is best told through its character interactions. Those it does very well. Girhim I've already mentioned. Zelda is also well written. A lot of people complained about the length of the intro in the original, but it did a good job in setting up her personality and getting me to like the character. In fact, some people grew to like her a little too much, perhaps. But it was necessary. It made being led around easier to swallow, and it gave certain story moments a lot more impact. But as good as those two are, they got nothing compared to Groose. We need to talk about Groose. Groose is a fascinating character. He has a crush on Zelda and he's jealous of Link's relationship with her. So when he gets down to the surface, he plans on saving her. But when the imprisonment breaks free, the truth of his situation makes itself clear. His self-image is shattered. He's not a hero, he's a normal person, and this guy he's been bullying is the destined hero. The delusions he's been harboring, even up to a moment ago, are dispelled. His ego, formed from his place at the top of his little hierarchy above the clouds, is wounded. Now, on its own, this isn't that unusual story archetype. A minor villain or rival realizes their lowly place in the world and has to confront it. The revelation is often unacceptable. They become embittered and resentful towards the hero, the gods, and the nature of being. Which makes Groose so awesome. What does Groose do? He gets the fuck over it and builds a rail catapult. Being a Chad is his therapy. And all of this culminates to this scene where Link is about to enter the Gate of Time to go see Zelda. Here, King, you dropped this. So let me come to my conclusion. Skyward Sword is not for everybody. It can be a miserable experience. I don't think some people have the temperament to put up with Skyward Sword's structure. I really like the game. I think it's a worthy entry into the Zelda series. But if you don't like the combat, you don't like the overworld, and can't tolerate the backtracking, then what value you can squeeze out of the things you do like is not going to tide you over for the whole game. But if you can get past its flaws, it also has some of the best dungeons, bosses, music, characters, and story that the series has ever developed. And for me, those highlights make the whole game worthwhile.